everyone, and welcome to today's session. I'm sorry we're a little bit late. We were having some technical issues, but we've got it all figured out now. My name is Elisabeth Blok, and I'm one of the three people organizing the Rotterdam Riot Science Club. The other two amazing girls that are organizing this with me are Lorenza Dall'Aggio and Bing Zhu. And the RIOT stands for Reproducible, Interpretable, Open and Transparent Science. And that's also in a nutshell what we aim to provide to the community. So we host monthly sessions, and this one is one of them, and we provide training to put the RIOT into science. We're part of the open science community in Rotterdam, and we also closely collaborate with the people from King's College London, where the RIOT Science Club originally started. And if you want to keep posted on our upcoming seminars, which are now all hosted online, you can subscribe to our mailing list or follow our website, to which we will post the details in the Q&A bar. And I think that's enough promo for the RIOT Science Club. So on to the session that we have for today. Our speaker will be Leo Tiokhin, which I hope I'm pronouncing somewhere near right. He's a postdoc at Eindhoven University of Technology, working together with Daniel Lakens on a project to improve the reliability and efficiency of psychological science. And his goal is to make the imperfect scientific process better. Today, he will talk about a project that has received a lot of attention already. I think there was a moment that my Twitter feed was basically filled with the Red Team Challenge. And without giving too much away, this project aims to improve the quality of scientific output by increasing the opportunities for error detection. And I feel this is a very interesting way to improve the way we do science, especially since we already know that the literature that we base our hypothesis on can sometimes feel crowded with errors that we can all make, as we're all human. Lastly, some housekeeping points. This is a live event, and that means that attendees are unfortunately not able to unmute themselves and ask their questions directly. However, we have a Q&A button in the top right corner, and we strongly encourage everyone to drop their questions there, either during or after the meeting. Lorenza, Bing, and I will be monitoring this Q&A and will ask all your burning questions to Leonid. Without further ado, because that's it for me, Leonid, take it away.
Cool. Thanks for the nice introduction. I can't see who's attending, so for all I know, there's one person in their pajamas watching this, or thousands of people all going to be criticizing my presentation. So that should be interesting. So it's really nice to be here and tell you a bit about the Red Team Challenge, a feasibility study of incentivized scientific criticism that was done with many co-authors of mine. And just to introduce myself a little bit before I get into the talk. I'm a postdoc working with Daniel Lakens, and I'm generally interested in incentive structures in science. That is how we can change incentives to improve the efficiency and reliability of science. And I've worked on a little bit of this in some empirical work and some theoretical modeling about incentives for kind of novel results or incentives for priority of discovery. I'm also pretty interested in improving the efficiency and reliability of academic publishing. We have a preprint about using signaling theory from biology to help improve academic publishing in various ways. And my background is actually in evolutionary anthropology. And so I'm quite interested in using evolutionary theory to provide insights into many different things, including potentially science. And most of my work has to do with, now, especially with theoretical modeling. I've done some field work back in the day when I was an anthropologist and lived in Indonesia and Armenia and all sorts of stuff. That doesn't really have anything to do with this. But I'm also recently quite interested in this idea of failing forward. That is how we can fail in science in ways that are productive, and especially how we can prevent unproductive ways of failing. And that's related to this Red Team Challenge that I'll get into now. So the Red Team Challenge was led by Nick Coles, who's a postdoc at Harvard. And it was his paper that we ended up criticizing. And it was done in collaboration with Ruben Arslan, who's at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, Daniel Lakens, who's my supervisor in Eindhoven, and Patrick Forscher, who is now at the University of Grenoble. So this was definitely, I was one of the people on this project. maybe not even the main person, and it was a big team effort. So I just want to emphasize that. And if you're interested in reading detailed information about this Red Team Challenge, you can check out the link at the bottom. The 100% Confidence Interval blog site had a few part series on this Red Team Challenge. So what motivated us to do this? So the main mechanism of quality control in science is peer review. Unfortunately, we know that peer review is, it's not useless, but it's imperfect in many ways. So we know errors slip through the cracks. We know this because people find errors in published literature after it has been peer reviewed. And we also just know this from empirical work where people have introduced errors into published papers. This was done with some randomized controlled trials in medicine, and then have individuals see how many individuals can detect those errors and whether training helps these types of things. And people do detect some things, like people are pretty good at detecting when things aren't randomized, but still for most errors, most people do not detect them. And in this paper, they introduced 9 major errors, and on average, people would have detected about 2.5 of each of these errors. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. We also know part of the reason why people are not very good at detecting errors, and one of them is that we don't really have incentives to do so. So we're all busy, we all have things to do, and we're not really rewarded for any of our peer review efforts. Maybe at most we get our names on like the Publons. You reviewed most papers this year, great, but it doesn't really have a tangible effect on our career. And so as a result, people don't really do a good job, and they oftentimes don't spend much time looking into a paper. And some parts of papers are never even checked. I mean, like imagine a code check or something like this. This, at least in my field, is nowhere near the norm. Nobody ever does this, even though people are increasingly using code and sharing their code. Another issue is that peer review typically happens after research has already been completed. So even if it could detect errors, there's a big waste there because it would have been more efficient had people detected some of these issues to begin with. And of course, for preprints, it doesn't even go through peer review. And so you have a whole different issue there. And recently, there have been plenty of high impact cases where, people publish things that have big errors. Like Andrew Gelman had a nice post about this, about the Stanford study estimating coronavirus prevalence in the US and some basic mistakes in that paper. But there's plenty of other examples. You can look at Stuart Ritchie's recent book if you want to get a bit depressed about the state of errors in science. And since I've been working on this project and, more involved in meta science, I've been sort of just every time I get a review, it sort of becomes more salient to me just how bad the review process is. And so for some recent papers, I just chose some comments that reviewers give. And they're things like, yeah, this is nice. I didn't really have time to check the code, so sorry. Okay. Someone else who gives a positive review of a paper said, yeah, I enjoyed this paper. It's a nice contribution, blah, blah, blah. But that's about it. So it's like, okay, you like the paper, but you didn't do anything to check whether anything I did was bullshit or not, basically, whether I made mistakes or anything like this. And then other people, even if they're negative and say, yeah, this model is crap because of this one thing, and other people have studied this, and that's about the extent of the review. So, that's barely getting at the tip of the iceberg of what you would actually need in order to figure out whether the paper is good or not, whether there's problems. And so it's not a surprise that if we're getting reviews like this, that you're getting errors published in the published literature. And so we had the idea that maybe a potential solution to this problem of error control could be to use red teams. So what is a red team? Well, a red team is a group that helps organizations to improve themselves by providing opposition to the organization's point of view. And so red teams are used most prominently in the tech industry and have a history of use in the U.S. military in order to provide opposition to what the organization is doing. So in tech, for instance, Microsoft has red teams that try and hack into the Microsoft's infrastructure and break down the software and things like this. So it's better to do these types of things before you put a product out to the market when the red team is sort of on your payroll than it is when you have hackers trying to hack your system for other reasons. So it benefits tech companies to do this. And the U.S. military does this in the context of having a thinking enemy. That is, you have a plan of attack or something like this, and you want there to be somebody who is trying to subvert that plan of attack and is trying to sort of beat you in this sort of competition and think ahead of you. And by having a red team do that, you can anticipate what an enemy would do. And so we thought that maybe this type of approach where you actively incentivize someone to provide an opposing point of view or specifically to find errors in your papers could potentially help to improve the quality of scientific work. And so we wanted to explore this as a possible solution. And what we did is we created this thing we called the Red Team Challenge. So as I mentioned earlier, it's nice to do this type of thing when a project is just getting off the ground because you prevent a bunch of wasted effort. We didn't really know whether people would be interested in this. We had never tried something like this before, so we wanted a sort of easier way of doing something like this, just to test its feasibility with an existing project. And so what we did is we took a paper that was already pre-printed, and we conducted a sort of incentivized criticism of this paper. And the paper was a paper by Nick Coles called Are Facial Feedback Effects Solely Driven by Demand Characteristics? That he had already conducted, and he was ready to submit this for publication with his co-authors. And so what we did is we put up $3,000 for 5 people to provide critical feedback on the materials, codes, ideas, every aspect of this paper. And so we recruited 5 individuals. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second, how we did that. And we paid each of them a $200 stipend just for their work. So regardless of whether they found errors. And then we also, on top of that, said we'd donate $100 to charity for every unique critical problem that they identified. And so we had somebody that was not involved in the paper, Ruben Arslan, categorize the errors and determine their severity. So he was supposed to be a neutral arbiter here because he had no stake in whether or not it's an error or not. It wasn't his money, anything like this. And we invited people to participate on social media platforms, primarily Twitter, the Psych Methods Facebook group, and I think Daniel Locken's blog as well. And so I think within a few days of the call, we had 22 people who had volunteered to participate, which is pretty cool. I mean, we didn't even know whether we'd get more than a few. And we divided these people up into categories of expertise that were relevant to the paper. And within each of those categories, we made a random number generator and just chose people at random. So because it was a paper about emotions, we chose someone from affective science, Asse Ines Care. We had someone who was a critic of the design and methods and who had expertise in that, Nick James. We had someone with expertise in statistics, Ingrid Aulike. We had an expert in computational reproducibility, Melissa Klein. And then we had a wild card, Tiago Lubiana, who turned out he had expertise in computational biology. And so what we did, given that incentive structure, is we gave these participants 3 weeks to identify issues with any part of the project. So we told them they could identify problems with any part of it, but of course, each of these individuals had specific types of expertise, and so maybe it was going to be more likely that, for instance, Ingrid focused on stats, or that Asse focused on things to do with emotions in general, things like this. So at the end of 3 weeks, it ended up that the Red Team members submitted a total of 107 error reports. Now, this doesn't mean that they found 107 errors. It means there was 107 things that they thought was worth it enough to submit an error report. And so Ruben went through these 107 error reports. Poor Ruben spent a lot of time doing that. And he decided there were 18 unique issues. That is, 18 of those 107 constituted errors of some type. And 5 of them were considered to be critical errors. That is, that would receive the $100 total for each of the critical errors, and the other issues received less. Ruben decided how much. So it ended up being a total charity payout of $660 from this. And after the red team challenge, Nick had been ready to submit this paper with his co-authors, but Nick decided that the errors were substantial enough that they wouldn't submit their manuscript, and they decided to run follow-up studies in order to address some of the concerns. So yeah, this prevented a paper basically from being submitted in a, I guess you could say, less mature state than it could have been otherwise. So I wanted to give you a sense of the types of issues that the red team detected in order to give you a better idea of, what are the things that are major, what are minor, what did people focus on. You can, of course, at this link here, you can check out all of the error reports. You can take a look at Ruben's assessment of them, and you can take a look at Nick's response. You can take a look at how much money was given out for each of them. It's a huge, long spreadsheet, so you can have plenty of fun doing that. So one of the major issues was non-blinding. That is, the researchers conducting the study were not blinded to the hypothesis and may have inadvertently influenced the participants' responses with their interactions because they knew that. And Nick admitted this was an issue. I think in psych, this is, I'm not sure how frequently double blind is done and how much it is considered, gold standard that people need to do. But Ruben assessed that this is it was one of the biggest problems that could have been easily prevented, basically. So, yeah, non-blinding issue. There was also an issue with a demand characteristic. So there were some instructions within the paper that one of the reviewers thought would imply something about what the experimenters hoped to find. And they said that if I was a participant, I would imagine hearing this and it leading to potential bias in reporting things. And the arbiter agreed that this was potentially an issue, that it wasn't clear, but it definitely wasn't definitely a non-issue. And so they categorized that as a critical error. And I think this is something Nick is, especially as well as the randomization, the non-blinding issue, Nick is addressing this in the follow-up. There was also an issue with the power analysis identified by one of the reviewers. So they argued that the sample size calculation was flawed because the power analysis was done for, a different design than what was actually done. And I think Nick ended up admitting this and saying, yeah, but we thought it was close enough, blah, 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 something like this. And the neutral arbiter agreed that this is a critical error because then you don't actually know what your power is to detect the effect. And also there was a critical error, for instance, in the supplemental materials. So there was a p-value that was calculated wrongly. It was calculated as less than 0.001, but it was actually 0.4. It wasn't for a critical test, but, if you end up doing corrections for multiple comparisons, it becomes not significant. And so still an error, and you don't want that kind of stuff in there. There were many, many minor issues. And so just to give you a sense of what these are, one of the issues was that a reviewer couldn't run the code. So you have computational reproducibility issues. It ended up being that, there was something set in the code, like evaluate equals false. And then if you set it to evaluate equals true, then you run the code and it's fine. So, technically it's a computational reproducibility issue, but really there's nothing, wrong in there. There was an error in calculating a confidence interval. I guess that was non-central in the supplemental materials, so the confidence bound was off. And I think it was just an error in how it was reported. There wasn't a check on all aspects of things that we would like to be randomized. So I think Nick did check, for instance, whether there was different amounts of males and females in the different experimental groups. So it didn't check whether the groups differed in their expectations about the experiments or their buy-in or things that might influence how they would have reported certain emotions. And there was also a mistake in the references, for instance. So something was cited as a blog post or a paper, but it actually was a blog post or something like this. So I want to give you a sense of, I guess, what we preliminarily learned from this and follow that up with some quotes from experiences of people who participated in this. So really, we did this as a sort of feasibility study. That is, can we even do something like this, get people to participate, make some sort of payout, incentivize them to do it? all this stuff. This was very sort of preliminary piloty thing. And I think that it worked out in that sense, So red teams are feasible. You can do it, at least in some conditions. It's not clear how we can generalize the conditions and make it better, but you could certainly do a version of red teaming in science. Our impressions, as you'll see from the comments, is also that the red teams did a more thorough job than traditional peer review. I think, especially if you compare it to some of those comments I gave earlier, actual peer reviews I get, for instance, and compare it to somebody who's going through the code and seeing whether, the eval equals false thing is there or not. Red teams definitely did a more thorough job. To emphasize, we all agreed that it would be useful to have red teams joining a project from the start. We didn't do the pilot like this, but this is a nice potential extension. And there are many, many things that I'd be especially curious to hear all of your ideas about how we can make this better or more feasible, or ways to figure out what might be better designs. And for instance, one of those is what would be a good compensation scheme, like whether people should be rewarded with authorship on a per error basis, whatever. So if we want to make these things practical, this is something we really need to think about and test experimentally. And we just came up with something that we wanted to reward people for their time. We didn't want something where it was just rewarded per error because they could spend 10 hours and maybe not find an error, but that's just because there's not an error there, for instance. So we wanted to just give fair compensation, but it's not clear what fair even is, and things like this. So So for some impressions from the people, so when we actually after this interviewed many of the red teamers as well, and to get their impressions of participating, and many of them said that they were just happy to find errors for a fair wage. So basically, a lot of them didn't really, care that much about authorship. They were just interested in, improving science, participating in something like this, and they like doing this type of work. And so, great, I get $200 to do it, sure. So one of the red teamers, I'll just read you some quotes of actual things they wrote. So one of the red teamers said that it was interesting that they didn't feel compelled to state whether they thought the work was relevant or novel. And I said, obviously, the authors thought it was important enough, so that's great. But the problem with the current peer review system is that it mixes the evaluation of thoroughness and novelty under the same brand. And this might not be optimal because, a good stats reviewer might not know whether the contribution is significant or incremental. And I totally agree with that comment. So that's pretty interesting. Another participant wrote a blog post about this, and she said that I wasn't in it for the money. I appreciated it, more artisan musically for me, but that's not what enticed me. It was a paper in the area where I have expertise about a topic that I care about. I was trying out a new technique for improving scientific literature and science in general. I felt I could make a contribution that was deeply meaningful. And she also had a comment here about what has been seen in the science process is in part what happens when critique and argumentation are not rewarded just the production of papers. So I think she's emphasizing the need for a sort of bigger rewards for people who do this types of work and how it might be contributing to certain issues in science right now. We also had some comments on this. So as I mentioned, there was a 3-part blog series about this where all of us wrote of our impressions from participating in this. So Nick wrote that many of the comments he received reflected a level of thoroughness that he hadn't encountered in traditional peer review. So again, substantiating the idea that the red team did a much better job than we were typically used to in peer review. Ruben mentioned how basically Nick was, kind of happy to have people detect errors and eager to admit them and things like this, and how this was different than when Ruben had criticized other research in the past and felt that it was a mood of a courtroom where you admit as little as possible and go on the counteroffensive. Of course, I think this is an artifact of the fact that, Nick was one of the people who helped us design this and wanted to do this. And so, of course, he's not going to do this and then at the end say, no, there are no errors. So I think this probably wouldn't happen in the real world, but it would be nice, I think, if we had an independent, sort of like an independent fact-checking agency, or how, I don't know, there's independent in the States, there's like agencies that check used cars, right? And give you a certificate that this is like a Honda, whatever, used certified Honda or things like this. And then we trust those agencies for their assessment. It would be nice if we had something like that, as opposed to saying you made a mistake and the author says, no, I didn't make a mistake, it was all right. And then we as observers say, oh, I guess I don't know, whatever. I guess I'll just go on and do my own work. I don't know who made this last comment, but I'll read it anyways. I think this was Ruben. So Ruben also said that his sense was that authors have had the experience that reviewer comments are a mixed bag of critical issues, nice to haves, and annoying idiosyncrasies and flat out wrong comments. This is part of my frustration with peer review and a reason why I doubt that peer review always improves a paper. I get the sense that there is no track for the professionalization and specialization of a critic as we have for research methods. Given how many errors sneak through undetected using the current approach in academia, it would be nice if we could pay these people, like red teamers, to do what they're best at and to hone their skills. So Ruben's pointing out how it would be nice if we actually had a niche for people who wanted to do this type of work instead of the current system, and I completely agree there with Ruben's comment. So I think, there's increasing recognition that we need to do more to detect errors in science, and we need to do more to reward people who do the work that sort of is the maintenance in science. So everyone wants to build, everyone wants to find out these novel findings, but then we don't have any of the people who kind of do the chores. And if you don't have people who are doing the chores or doing the maintenance, then everything just falls apart, right? I don't think you could run a society the way that we run science. So I think all of us share this sentiment, and all of us would like to do something to improve the state of error detection in science right now. And I think that there's many sort of leading people in the field, inspiring people who also share these sentiments. And so I hope that this red team thing is, a step in a useful direction, and to help us think about how we might do this. And I'm especially interested in all of your thoughts about where we can go from here, how we can improve this, your own experiences with these types of issues, whether red teams are something that you would pay for or like as a service, or whether you would hire people, or whether you would participate as a red teamer, or any other thoughts. So I really appreciate all of your time. Thanks for listening to the talk, and I hope we can have a nice discussion about this. So thanks very much.
Awesome, Leonid. Thank you so much for this introduction to what you did, and a nice combination, I think, of what the red teamer said afterwards and what your experience was as the core team who sort of started this initiative. I think Lorenza is now busy migrating all the questions that we got over to for everyone to see. But let me start off with a question that I had for myself. So you talked about that for this initiative, you invited the red team when the results, when the analyses were already run, right?
Yeah.
When do you think would be the optimal point to invite red teamers? Is that still after the analyses are run?
I definitely don't think it's after the analyses are run. I don't know when before that would be best. So I would imagine, you have somebody who, has expertise maybe in things that your team has less expertise in, or from the start, basically. So somebody who has no interest in the publication, blah, blah, and who basically gets rewarded just on the extent to which they can find problems with your project or help you improve a project, and have them as part of a project from the start would be the idea. So maybe you need to hire someone in the beginning stages to point out, like, hey, you're going to do this meta-analysis, but you're doing it in a way that's going to miss a bunch of studies, right? You don't want to do that after you've already collected the studies and pre-registered it, but haven't analyzed it or something. And then you have someone in the stage after you do the data collection of how do we analyze this, for instance. And then you have someone, you made the code, and you have someone that helps with computational reproducibility or something like this. So I definitely think it's not the way that we did it, but that said, it's better to do it this way than to not do it at all. So, I, for instance, now am working on I have a paper, and it's already done, and the code's written, and the results are out, and, it's already under review. And so now it's it's better that I hire someone now to check things and check my code than it is to just publish it and then just hope that everything's okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's a cool idea to have like different red team members at different stages so that they can practice their own expertise at those different stages. Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, then we'll have the second question. So because the red team challenge is also about money. So our second question is, how would this concept work in countries that are less wealthy? Because if the researcher want to hire someone who can help her to do the error detection, and they should pay them the fair wage. But what about the situation in the less wealthy countries?
Yeah, that's a big issue. I think this is it's a extension of the same issues we already have in academia. So, for instance, if I'm in a less wealthy country, or maybe that's less prestigious for academic work, I already have problems getting feedback, criticism, collaborating with people, things like this. I don't have access to people who, if I'm at a less prestigious university, I don't have access to people as much who like are big names in the field or know how the system works and play the game and things like this. So this is, it's always going to be an issue. So I agree. There needs to be some sort of like, how journals provide sometimes fee waivers for submission fees if you're from a country where you can't afford to pay this, or you're in a situation where you can't. If we really take this seriously, we need everyone's research to be able to be, red team basically. And so maybe you have, grants that can, help people that are especially for people who couldn't afford to do this on their own. But I really, this is kind of a BS answer. I don't know. I agree it's a problem, and I think I would be interested to hear people's thoughts about it.
Yeah, thanks. I also think that it is really a very difficult question. And so we have another question. Because we just talk about we can find people with different expertise, and the next question is, how are we able to find the people that have enough expertise to be part of the red team? How can we find the right person?
I do have an answer to it. Yeah. So, there needs to be, how do you find somebody who, is going to fix your sink if it's clogged and you can't do it yourself? Or how do you find a mechanic, right? I mean, all of these things, there's services that use websites you can go to. How do you find a house to stay in for a few days that specialize in these types of things? So, my feeling is we need a service that will do this for academia. Like if you're really good at code review and you have a history of, you can show people projects in which you've done this, you can have examples of your work, like you've worked on projects and people give you reviews and say, this is, somebody who does a very good job. You should be able to sell your skills to other people, and people should be able to find you. So I think we need a service that will basically connect people who are looking for criticism to people who have those skills. I mean, as academics, we do a lot of shit for free, and we shouldn't, basically. You should be rewarded for peer reviewing, and you should be held accountable if your peer reviews are bad. So the same thing goes for a red team.
Yeah, I'm going to use my producer rights to ask a follow-up question that I have myself on this one. So, did you have a prior set of people or expertises that you wanted to include, or did you just send it out to everyone, and then based on the people that you got for your red team chose? Well, you got where.
Yeah, so we just sent it out. We didn't know who would apply, and maybe there would be expertises that were like, oh, we didn't even know that, and then we categorized them based on what they said their expertise was, and then we picked based on that. But this is a good question, I think, for two reasons. So you might imagine a system where you already know exactly what you need, like you need a statistician. But I think for a lot of things, we don't know. We're like, I want this paper to be good. I want to make sure there's no mistakes. You can think of a few things, but you don't really even know what you're missing. So you also need something where where people are able to tell you, what it is that you don't know, sort of like the unknown unknowns. Like if you want to throw a party, or a wedding, you might not even know what all the stuff is that goes into it. You might think like, oh, I need to choose the flowers or like whatever, but you might not need to think about like whatever. What do we do if it's raining? We need to have a contingency plan and whatever. I don't know, all this stuff. So yeah, that's why you have wedding planners. Yeah.
No, this is true. And then I'm assuming that people could state their expertise like in a free text field. So you didn't ask for specific sorts of expertise upfront to, are you a statistician or are you a librarian? I don't know.
Right.
Okay,
right.
Cool.
Yeah.
We have a question from we have two questions from Isabel. The first one is, I have always learned in psychology that internal motivation is better, in quotations, than external motivation. Why do you think in academia this does not work that way?
I actually think the internal-external thing is kind of not a useful categorization. I know psycho is quite popular in psych. I think it's kind of this false dichotomy. So, I'm internally motivated. I'm motivated to do good science. I want to do it. But that motivation is shaped by external factors. It's shaped by whether I get appreciated for doing this type of work. It's shaped by whether I get money. It's shaped by all of the things that sort of incentivize behavior, not incentivize in a financial sense. I mean, in a broad sense, the things humans care about. So, and I noticed this for myself in my career about, earlier in my career, I really cared about certain things. And then, you care about making sure you're saying a word exactly right in a paper, for instance, and that you're checking every single reference and reading it really, really thoroughly. And then you do it and then nobody cares. You don't get any reward for it. So then I lose the intrinsic motivation to do that. But that's because the intrinsic motivation is in part a function of the external environment. So I think in academia, people do this. Like people spend 2 days on a peer review and they do a really good job. And then what do they get for it? They just get more requests to peer review it, to take more time, and then they keep doing this. And then they see other colleagues maybe not doing this and spending more time just kind of selfishly on themselves. And then they get ahead and then they lose the motivation to do this. So I think, what was the question? It was about, why the internal motivation doesn't work well in academia. I think it's because we come into it with these kind of ideals and we're told it's going to be rewarded. Like, yeah, this is what science is all about and stuff. And then it turns out it's not. And so we lose part of that motivation. I don't think like most other industries in the world, are not going to work on the types of incentives that exist in academia. We're just weirdly like generous with our time and things like this. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do have to agree there that we indeed spend a lot of time doing stuff that you basically don't get a real reward for. So I think it's a particularly interesting way to incentivize people. And yeah, that's also what you get back, right? That people said, well, we just liked to do that and do the error detection for the money that we got.
Yeah. Are there other questions, or should I just say stuff?
Yeah, we have another one from Isabel that is asking, although I would love to be part of a red team, but I do think it can be hard to look for mistakes. How would you make sure there are no hard feelings about the red team?
Hard feelings? Do you mean? Do you mean like the person who gets mistakes found in their paper is mad at the people who found them or something like this?
I'm for the moment assuming she does mean that, but I think she's here. So Isabel, if you didn't mean that with your question, feel free to clarify. But yeah, I think hard feelings against the red team from the one who wrote the paper.
I don't know. So I think so there's different ways it could work. One of the ways I think, I'm trying to think of an analogy here. So if you have an independent red team where it's not for hire, but it's this independent agency, then there's going to be hard feelings. Like imagine you're a pharmaceutical company and you produce some drug, you invest a bunch of money in it, and then it has some side effects that you kind of hide, and then a red team comes in and points those out or something. Yeah, it's going to suck. You're going to lose a bunch of money now, but too bad. We're not trying to optimize the outcome of the company. We're trying, to optimize the outcome of society in that case. Or here we care about science. I don't care about, whether the people feel bad that they kind of did work that has a mistake. Like don't do work that has mistakes, or build in things that will find those mistakes. So that's kind of, it doesn't answer the question because it doesn't answer how do you make sure there aren't hard feelings. I think what we need is, so right now there's not many rewards for error detection, and what really matters is not whether your work is right or not, but whether it can get published in certain outlets or not. And so if you have people find an error and you prevent that sort of publication, of course the person's going to feel bad because they just basically lost like a payoff. They were going to get this thing and now they don't. That sucks. I think the only way to prevent it is to, I'm not going to say change mindset. I think to change incentives so that you get penalized so much for publishing work that is like has major errors, for instance, or you get such a reputational boost for doing work that's obviously of a higher quality that people actually themselves now have an incentive to find errors in their own work. So imagine if you were working for a company and like you got fired if your code has bugs, then you're going to have real big incentive to like, have someone who has a lot of expertise in this domain, like check your code, right? Because you're like, yeah, I'll pay you money. Just like, I want to make sure this is good because or else I'm going to get fired. Right now, we don't have this. We have this, like, you get rewarded if you just produce the code and something. I don't know. We have a weird thing. So I think there needs to be enough of a reward to make it worth, so there's some probability they find an error and your paper doesn't get published or whatever. And that's the cost, but you need to have some benefit for just doing the better practice. And on top of that, for differentiating yourself from the people who do not do this. So I think the same thing's happening with a lot of open science practices where it's a cost, but we're hoping at some point you will get a reward by differentiating yourself from everyone else by having it be open data, pre-registered, higher sample size, blah, blah, blah. Of course, if you're just paying the cost, but you're still not getting any sort of reward, then you're just, these people are not going to survive in academia. So we need, for instance, I'm hoping in like a decade, there will be a world where we look at papers and we're like, oh, wow, this one is, passed the red team test, or here's what the red team detected. But it was the kind of minor stuff or whatever. And then you look at another paper and they're like, yeah, they didn't red team it. And you're like, yeah, okay. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be awesome to live in a world where we could look at papers and be like, yeah, it's not red team, so we're not sure. That would be nice. And obviously in your case, you had contact with the red team afterwards. So you asked them how they felt about the process. But in the process, so they did the error detection, then Ruben or the arbiter decided whether it was major or minor. And I'm thinking about this in a bit of a traditional peer review manner. So then Nicholas was the one who wrote the paper, right? He had to go back to the original errors that were pointed out. And did he respond to the red team in the same manner as you would respond to questions raised by peer review?
No. So I think with peer review, it depends. You're usually trying to convince an editor or the reviewers, So you are trying to convince the reviewer to give you a thumbs up recommendation, but at the end of the day, the editor makes the decision. And so you're kind of responding in this way that's trying to make yourself look good for the editor, or like at least convince the editor that maybe the reviewer is wrong or something. I think in Nick's case, you're trying to do something different. I think for Nick's specific case, he wanted to be part of this. He cares a lot about doing high quality work. And so he was just mostly motivated to decide whether or not it was an error and then fix it. He knew it was all going to be public. It was part of this red team thing. And I would guess for normal, for normal situation, you're trying to convince some much broader audience now that your work is good. And then it depends on how much they trust the red team or not. So, for instance, can you get away with saying, no, this is not actually a mistake when the red team has pointed it out? Or are people like, no, look, the red team pointed out, you need to address this because we trust them as an independent agency. I think the more that people can get away with it or more can argue with the red team, the more they're going to have an incentive to, convince the general public basically that, or whoever, the non-red team, whoever is going to be reading their paper, that actually, no, this thing is not a problem. But again, this is where I think we need a trustworthy, like, independent agency, basically. Like you have, if you audit things in the world or something like this, you just trust the auditing agency. They're neutral, independent, and their goal is just to, find if there are problems, like the organic apple is not actually organic, and then you trust them a lot more than you do the person who has an incentive to say, no, this actually, like, whatever, this pesticide I used actually is fine, even though it's not really organic, whatever.
And were there points like that? So were there errors that were detected where you had a discussion afterwards with the red team to what extent they had to be addressed?
So what happened was the red team made comments. Mm-hmm. Nick responded and also discussed a bit with Ruben, and then Ruben made the independent. I think maybe, I wonder if I don't remember if Ruben made judgment first and then Nick responded. I think Nick did it first, but I don't quite remember. So you can see exactly all of the discussion in the spreadsheet. So there were definitely things where it must have been that Nick responded first, because there were definitely things where Nick said, yeah, but we were actually we didn't care about this thing, blah, blah. And then Ruben said, yeah, but Nick's response is kind of minimizing. I think this is an error. So you can see some of the things where, Nick was, maybe incentivized to be like, it's not that big a deal. And then the independent reviewer was like, no, I actually think it is somewhat of a big deal. But it's nice. So the nice thing about this as well is, everything's open and, so people can see all of these interactions themselves and see who said what, versus, I think, another issue with peer review, which is a whole nother thing, is the anonymity and the fact that reviews aren't shared. So when you have a paper, it just has a stamp of approval, like journal X, and you don't actually know all the discussion that went into it. So it would also, even if we didn't have red teams, if you just made peer reviews open, you can see the extent to which it was actually subject to criticism. So, I mean, imagine you see a paper that was peer reviewed and all the reviewers are like, great, I think this is great, super novel, yeah, let's publish it. And so you're like, wow, this paper wasn't reviewed at all. And, contrast that with a paper where some reviewers like, yeah, I reproduced all of the code and blah, everything's right, and then I did this and I did this. So there's a sort of differentiation that's all mushed together right now because you don't see that.
I think this is a great extension indeed. And I think this also circles back to what Isabel asked. So because you had an independent arbiter, that was a way to sort of circumvent the hard feelings, because Nick had to discuss with him whether certain points.
I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Thanks.
Oh, there you go.
I'm sorry, I was indeed muted. But what I wanted to say was this also circles back to what Isabel asked. So because you had Ruben there, that also made it easier to not for hard feelings to not arise, I think.
Yeah, although I'll say, right now I'm also hiring someone to check some code for a project of mine, and I can feel the tension inside myself. I'm like, oh, like, I do want him to find errors, but oh god, please, like, I hope he doesn't find anything big. And you can't avoid this stuff, when what things would benefit your career, and yeah.
True. I think this is the same as when you send your manuscript to your PI and you just hope that they like what you've done, but you're going to get it back filled with comments and marks which you can improve, which you want to do, but it feels also like, I could have done better the first time.
Yeah.
All right. So we have 5 more minutes, and I see a question here that was also about comparing it to the peer review process. So you made a distinction between novelty and thoroughness, which is very interesting, I think. So papers are judged on their novelty, but also on how well the methodology was executed. But would you say that this distinction needs to be entered into the peer review system so that we can make a clearer distinction between the two and evaluate a paper on both aspects?
Yes, of course. And I think that it depends on what the journal's evaluation criteria are, but I think many journals do this. They will ask, like Nature of Human Behavior asks this, for example. The problem is not the differentiation. I agree it's important. The problem is, does the reviewer have expertise to make the differentiation? So I might, as I think, who pointed this out? I think Tiago, it was Tiago's comment. He said, yeah, like I can go through your code and be like, your code is shit and there's a mistake. I might have no idea about the domain of your paper. I might have no idea how this fits into the field. So, you shouldn't ask me about its novelty. There should be some people whose novelty opinion is either disregarded or weighted a lot less than others, right? So I think right now there's a problem in academia that everyone's expected to do everything. Like it's not really that modular. Like you don't have like, I'm going to focus on the code and here's the experimental design person. And then we can have a team where everyone's really good at a specific task. There are some of those, but I think a lot of us are expected to do a lot of things. And so we're not really, you're expected to evaluate, for instance, novelty and thoroughness of a paper. And maybe you don't even know. So I think I do this sometimes with peer reviewing, that I get asked to review a paper and I say, okay, I can like evaluate the theory, the stats is beyond me. So please, like, I'm not even going to say anything there. So I think we already experienced a bit of this tension.
Yeah, and I think it's great because it's also important when you peer review something that you explicitly state where your expertise is and what's not your expertise. So that's an interesting additional point for everyone who's doing peer review duties.
Right, I agree.
Yeah, so we have the last question. The last question is that you said that co-authorship could be an extension, but did you ask your red team whether they would want to become co-author on the paper?
Yeah, we did. Most people didn't think it was a good idea. So we didn't do this because we didn't want like a disincentive against criticism. So the idea was maybe if you criticize too hard, the paper won't even get published and then you won't get your co-authorship and you get nothing. We interviewed some red teamers and some people said, yeah, I guess this would be okay sometimes. But a lot of people said, I'm not at a point in my career where this matters or I care about co-authorship, or I'm not going to go into academia. So why would I care about co-authorship? So I think, money, everyone can do something with money. Whereas with co-authorship, it's really only valuable to a more narrow subset of people. So I don't think this is a good idea. And I also think the co-authorship, it mixes in a bunch of things. At best, you can have like a list of here's the red team members and here's what they did. But again, I think, people need to be rewarded with tangible things. So I think the money thing is the way to go. The issue is, of course, in the future, if people just expect that they'll only do this for money, then now you need to give people money to peer review, which maybe is great. And I think there is enough money around. Journals make plenty of money, things like this to do this. But you're going to, as soon as people start getting money for this, it's going to kill, sort of crowd out the other more, whatever moral, reputational, whatever reasons for doing peer review. But I think it's the way to go. I mean, if you want something to be done well and you want to reward people for their time, that's what you got to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. Because the co-authorship might involve too many other issues, but the money is an easier way to go, and might be more useful for most of the people.
Yeah, and it'll probably also incentivize people outside of academia. We can sometimes, or I at least, can be in the academia bubble for a bit. But of course, people outside of academia could be part in red teams too, because they might have the right expertise, but don't want to be in research per se, doing the whole process.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it has a potential to, it does have the potential to increase the diversity of the types of people who are willing to provide scientific criticism. Of course, there are all those issues earlier about, how will people from countries or in situations where they don't have the financial resources to do that, how will they do it? So that's a problem that needs to be solved. I agree. But yeah.
All right. I think we made it through all the questions that were asked exactly in time. So that's quite perfect. Leonid, thanks a lot for this talk. I think it was particularly interesting. And everyone who attended, thanks for being here and joining us today and asking all your questions. I think we had the opportunity to ask quite a lot. So that was awesome. And I hope to see everyone at our next Riot session.
Cool. Thanks very much for having me. Enjoy the weekend, everyone.